organizing for almost 10 years now, and my most recent claim to fame is being on the team that helped to flip Maricopa County and Arizona blue in the 2020 election. So very excited to be leading this training with Vivian.
Woohoo! Yes, very exciting. Lots of appreciation for that in the chat. Can we get some thumbs up? Okay, so a few housekeeping slides. I think this might be familiar for folks who've been attending the summit, but we'll go over them again. So first off, some community agreements. And so, come as you are. We want folks to show up to the space with your authentic selves. So reflect on like what you need to do that, right? We're in a virtual conference. You can step away. You can like put your standing desk up, go outside, do whatever you want. Just make it comfortable for you and, in a way that you can engage the best that you want to. Second, trust lived experience. When someone speaks to their lived experience, believe them, trust that, even if it might not be like the same as what you've experienced, because we all have our own stories and narratives and experiences in our own lives. Thirdly, know yourself. So we understand that these topics will bring up different things for different people. So just take breaks as you need. We also have a care team booth. So if anyone needs help like processing or just wants to take a break, you can head over there. And then next up, make space, take space. So if folks are familiar with this one from organizing, making space means making space for other people to share, to jump in. And take space means if you're usually someone who's more quiet and you don't necessarily chat, we encourage you to do more of it, right? So that folks are being able to participate in more equitable ways. And then lastly, one diva, one mic. So if you have like a specific comment that you want to share, you can type stack in the chat. And then I think that someone will help us unmute you. But otherwise, feel free to use, we definitely want folks to like using the chat a lot during our session. So feel free to just put things in there. Awesome. Okay. And then how should we use this chat? So definitely you all are using it great right now. Feel free to, as we talk about, details of power mapping, you can share how that relates to your personal experience, what you're seeing in your own community, share any campaigns or projects that you're working on. I think what's awesome is like, right, we've already found 3 people from the Central Jersey area in the chat. So maybe you can find someone who's working on environmental justice together. So do use the chat in that way, connect with other folks and ask us questions. Yeah. And then as for some guidelines for the chat, please don't use the chat to promote your business organization. Don't share external links, phishing, it's out there, cybersecurity. And, don't spam the chat or share information that's not relevant to our session. Cool. Okay, diving right in. So our agenda, we just did welcome and intros. Lizzie's going to take us through concepts overview and level setting. We'll talk about power mapping, researching your targets, and closing. And that'll be a really quick 50 minutes.
Excellent. So a quick point of framing before we really dive into the power mapping content. So this training is intended to be a more advanced training. We're making some assumptions here that you've been involved in a little bit of organizing, maybe you're actively involved in a campaign. So we'll do a quick concept review here in a few minutes, but this is intended to be a little bit more of an advanced training. Our objectives today are for folks to understand what a power map is and why we do them and how they help us understand our targets and our self-interest. We want to introduce research meetings as an important related skill, an important method to help you build your power map. And we also want to introduce power mapping as a process and as a skill that you can take with you. So that's our framing for today, just to get us started. Let's go into a little bit of concept review just to make sure that we're all on the same page and all of the sort of vocabulary that we're using makes sense to folks. So first of all, we want to really ground this idea of power mapping within the larger framework of an organizing strategy. So in an organizing strategy, you have your wants. Your want is your concrete, achievable goal, the thing that you want to achieve as a result of your organizing efforts. Your haves are the things that you already have at your disposal. These are your resources, your Twitter followers, your relationships, money, funding that you may have, anything that is a resource to you, skills, anything like that. Finally, you have your needs. Your needs are the things that are the bridge between your haves and your wants. So they're the things that you don't have yet, but you need them to achieve your final goal. And I'll get into an example in a minute. So the definition that we use at Rising Organizers Action for an organizing strategy is turning what you have into what you need to get what you want. For example, if our want is for undocumented workers to receive $5 million in local government cash assistance, I'm going to skip down to the bottom. Maybe we have some people, we have personal stories and experiences, we have access to social media with a Twitter handle with 700 followers. Maybe we have some skills to write op-eds. Maybe we have action skills, organizing skills. But other things that we might need are public attention from the press, the mayor and the city council. We might need the city council to vote for the funding. So we can use the things that we already have, our people, our social media presence, to get the attention that we need, and eventually achieve the outcome that we want for undocumented workers to receive this $5 million. So that's kind of the context of strategy that we're working within today. So when we talk about targets, which are this is where the power mapping really comes in when we're thinking about targets. So we use the term primary targets. These are the individuals who have the power over what you want. So maybe it's the mayor, maybe it is a school board officials, maybe it is the president of an organization, maybe it is a member of Congress, but someone who has a power to do the thing that you want to achieve. And then we have secondary targets. These are individuals who have power over primary targets. So maybe it is someone who really has the ear of the CEO of a company, and you'd like to influence that CEO and get the CEO to do something. Maybe it is a specific reporter who has like a lot of clout in the area that you're working in, and a scathing op-ed or a scathing article by this reporter is going to make a big wave on your issue. So we can think about primary targets and secondary targets as playing a big role in how we work through our strategy. And these are the people that we're really thinking about when we're building a power map. So one quick note on targets is I think it's easy for us to get caught in an amorphous target, right? Whether we're working on an issue, we want to target, a organization, or we want to target a group of people. But it's really helpful to think of targets as a person, an individual that has self-interest. So something that they care about. Their self-interest may not be readily apparent, and it's we'll get into sort of how you can go through figuring out that self-interest, but try to think of an individual. So feel free to throw in the chat if you're working on something right now. Who is your target? Who's the target that you're really thinking about? Who's the person that has the power to give you what you want, or to make the change that you want to see? Okay, local mayor, Joe Manchin, excellent. Kirsten Sinema, yes, I'm from Arizona. I feel that. These are great. These are great examples of targets. And we can even start to think about like who are secondary targets that might have the ear of these people. So before we get into this next section, I'll just say on targets that MoveOn has a free petition tool that is available for folks to use. And on the petition tool, there's a way to actually target an individual. So this can be a really great way to launch your campaign, to launch a petition, to start to build a movement, and to really have like a first engagement with your targets. So with that, I'll pass it on to Vivian to take us through mapping our targets.
Thanks, Lizzie. So I think a lot of us have been in that place of like, I know who my target is. They're all the way up here, Joe Manchin on his houseboat. But how do we get there? I mean, we can kayak, right? But what are the other ways to get there and figure out what are the levers of power? What resources do we have at our disposal? It's power mapping, right? So power mapping, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but this is a really classic model we're going to share, and a really simple model, because sometimes we want to start simple before we can get into the really like complex details. So power mapping, first of all, the purpose. You're going to identify who has power around a certain issue, the issue you're working on. You're also going to identify the people in opposition and the people aligned with us. So, who has power? That could be someone aligned with you, could be someone opposed, but they're all different, they work on different axes. So that's why you see on the screen, we have the left, right. That's who opposes or is supportive. And then north, south is more powerful, less powerful. So we're going to show you a bunch of examples. And basically the sample for this power map is that we're trying to get a mask mandate for my school district. So if let's say that's my campaign, let's map out some stakeholders. And there's lots. So I'm just going to walk through these examples, but as I'm doing it, feel free to put more ideas in the chat, because I love to see, like, especially, I'm sure there's folks on here who probably worked on this at the local level too. So actually, this idea comes from one of our local organizers for my organization in Michigan, and she had a mask mandate at her children's school, but it wasn't district-wide. So she's like, I got to keep fighting, because it's not just my children that I care about. I care about children all across this district, all across the city. So if we start in that top left corner, right, top means they're more powerful or influential. Left means they're more opposed to your objective. So conservative lobbyists, like obviously opposed, right? There's a lot of anti-masking, anti-vaxxing. So that's why they're going to be like the farthest on the side of opposition. They have, definitely on the side of more power than less. But someone, for example, like the district superintendent, they're going to have a lot of power at the top because they can set that policy. Ultimately, them and maybe the school board have probably the most control over a mask mandate. But the superintendent, we're going to put them on like less opposed, unless we know for sure, right? So this isn't like a sample district. So they're like kind of against it. They're like, I don't really want to enforce it, but maybe there's definitely ways we can convince them. Moving down a little bit, anti-mask parent groups. They're definitely opposed, right? We want a mask mandate. They're anti-mask. In terms of power, they could go above, below, right? It depends on how organized they are and, who's in it, how much they've been meeting and things like that. So if there's like a loose assemblage of people, but they don't really show up to school board meetings, they just shout a lot on Facebook, they may not be that powerful. But if they do start coming to board meetings, if they're like calling the district office, then they get more and more power, right? So that's why, at least in this example, they straddle that line, because they could be more powerful, they could be less. Moving on to the middle, PTA president. Again, this is a sample. Maybe your PTA president is all the way into the right, supportive of your objective. That would be beautiful. In this example right now, they're someone we haven't talked to. So they're going to be in the middle, slightly supportive, but they don't necessarily have like a strong stance, or they haven't even been questioned about it. And then they're right there, like they definitely have some power. They're president of the PTA. They, got there for a reason. They have influence over some parents, but they might not be the most powerful person on here. And then continuing right, we see educator unions and union lobbyists. So those are folks, right? The educator unions, those are the teachers. Those are the folks in the classrooms every day, distancing in a classroom that doesn't have HVAC, it barely has masking, right? So they're definitely impacted. They're definitely supportive of this objective. And then, to the right of that, union lobbyists, like those are folks who are going to be talking to the school district. They're going to be trying to set policies that really are favorable to their members, our teachers. Below them, we might put parents of students under 12. So, 12 years old is a critical age here just because of the vaccine availability. So, these are parents whose kids don't have access. So they care more about masking because they're like, my child really, really needs a mask. They don't have a vaccine. They're super vulnerable. So obviously they're very supportive. Again, they could be powerful. They could be it could be more powerful. They could be less powerful. And it really depends on how we're organizing or how other folks are organizing. And then lastly, at the bottom under there, specifically on this issue, right? Students under 12, probably supportive, definitely could be even more supportive if we organize them. But in terms of power, like in our society, children have much less power, right? A lot of folks just treat them as like people without agency. So at this moment in time, they're definitely bottom of the totem pole, but we are wanting to bring them into this work, right? They can be storytellers. They can be folks who are speaking at a school board meeting as well, because they're literally the impacted population here. And then lastly, the local Democratic Party. So we wanted to put a mix of folks like in the school example, and then as well as like some of the classic, power holders we might be thinking about. But in this case, this is really helpful to think about, right? So actually the party here is not necessarily the powerful influencer here because it's about school policy. So we want to map them out, but we also want to recognize, for every campaign, these people on here, these post-it notes, they might move around. So that's really important that we actually like really intentionally map this out. So yeah, I'll move on to the next slide, pass it back to Lizzie. But if folks want to put in the chat just like any other ideas of who else that we should put on here. Yeah. But yeah, I'll turn it back to Lizzie to talk about how we get the information to make this power map accurate.
Great. So one thing, but before we move on here, the next thing that we're going to get into is researching your targets. And the way that I see this is that researching your targets and building your power map is a sort of like simultaneous cyclical process. So your power map is not static. It can be like an evolving sort of document and understanding as you get more information about the stakeholders that you're working with. So maybe a council member that you thought was going to be not friendly to your cause turns out to actually be friendly. In that case, they would get moved, right? So the researching can sort of help you inform your power map and actually create your power map. And researching is a way to really test the theories that you initially put down on your power map. So I see this as a sort of related skill and related process. Before we get into research meetings, which is another skill that we want to introduce today, we're going to just talk about self-interest of our targets and really understanding what they care about, what is going to influence them, who they're going to listen to. So we define self-interest as what motivates a person to act or to not act. What is the thing that is going to motivate them to do something, to sign legislation, to introduce a bill, to support the thing that you're working on, to not support the thing that you're working on? What's going to motivate them to do something? So we may not know the self-interest of our targets, but we probably have some kind of a theory. And when we think about targets, we can often think about their self-interest as falling into two categories: self-preservation and self-actualization. So self-preservation would be like somebody who wants to keep their job. They want to get reelected. They want to serve another term. They want to maintain their like status as CEO of some company. And self-actualization is they have an agenda or a set of values that they actually want to see happen in the world. They have like goals and things that they're trying to accomplish. And they want to like, they have an agenda that they want to put forward. So we really need to figure out the self-interest of our targets if we're going to get them to do the thing that we want them to do to achieve our goal. So it's important. I think it's great to develop a theory of self-interest, but it's important not to assume the self-interest of a target is always going to be the same, and not to assume the self-interest of a target in general, right? So the first thing is to just do some basic research. And I think that you can find, we just put some sample questions on here and sample topics to research. I think that you can find a lot of information just from like your basic Google searching. So thinking about like work or power, they're sort of like public presence initially feels like a good way to start. Where do they work? Who do they work with? What are committees that they sit on? Who is like on the corporate board of directors for the company that they work for? What role are they in? How long have they been in that position? What did they do before? I think it's really telling to look back at someone's previous career and say, they seem to have this theme of public service, or they seem to have this theme of community engagement. I think that can really help you start to form your self-interest, the self-interest of your target. Next, you can think about public affiliations. So what do they do? Maybe this isn't their job, but a sort of like public thing that they do. Are they really involved in their alumni association of the college that they went to? Do they sit on the board of any nonprofits? What are the charity galas that they attend every year? And finally, you can think about personal values. Are they religious? Do they have a family that they're really involved with? Are they on their high school alumni association? Do they have sort of things that could suggest personal values? Are they like an avid biker, or do they go every week to the Wicker Park Farmers Market, right? That could be important information to know if you want to like plan a bird dog later on. So we have these sort of research questions, which I think is like a great way to prepare, is like a good way to prepare for a research meeting, which Vivian will talk more about in a moment. But it's also a good way to begin to build your theory of their self-interest and start to think about what is going to move them, this person who has all of these different identities and pieces of themselves. What part of that, like, how can we make sure that we're really speaking to them in a powerful way? So let's dive into research meetings. Vivian.
So research meetings, what are they? Like Lizzie said, these are planned meetings with either our targets or people in power who have something to say about our issue that we want to learn about, or it's an expert who knows the ins and outs of the issue. In this training, we're just going to talk about the first one. And we use research meetings to accurately, answer the questions that Lizzie was posing. And you also might have heard them known as research actions. They are meetings, but you can call an action too. And so the goal, primary goal is, like it says, research, right? We're figuring out who are our targets, primary, secondary, what's their self-interest. This doesn't have to happen all in one meeting, but that's the kind of information we're looking for. And what's it going to take to move them to where we want to move them? So maybe also we're trying to build a relationship. So this meeting is the beginning of a long series, right? I mean, if folks are most familiar, like a lobby meeting can be a research meeting. But also it could be a meeting that happens outside where we have a bunch of our, members of our group to show strength together. So you have different goals coming into it, but you really want to design this intentionally to be able to do that. How many people should you bring? We put 5 to 10 here to be it's reasonable. You're not trying to get a huge group of people like a rally, but the more people, the better. So especially if you have a Zoom meeting, you can have a ton of folks just on there to observe, to show there's a ton of people who care about this. Look, there's 30 of us on this call, but yeah. And then, one target, maybe their staffer. So that's the top line. Next slide would be great. So the 4 Ps, best practices for us going into our research meetings. First of all, purpose. We always want to start with purpose in mind. So what information do we want to get from this person? Also, how do we expect them to respond to us? Do we have to challenge this person, right? Is it just strictly educational sharing, or more likely, we're going to get some pushback? What's our response to the response? Secondly, person. How much do we already know? How is our Google stalking gone? And what do we want them to think of us? So that might influence what kinds of questions we're asking, who's asking them, the phrasing, who's the messenger. And then secondly, for person, what kind of relationship do we want with them? And who do they have relationships with already that can influence our issue? Next up on the 4 Ps, yes, this framework is great. Next slide, please. So next up, we have politics. What are people saying about the issue we're focusing on? Is this politically salient? People also here, right? Every time we have a general word, we really want to hone in on that. So it may not be, here on this slide, but we have our campaign plan in the background. So people is again, folks with power. Is it local media? Is it the mom blogs that are really popular in the area? Is it I don't know, some local TV reporter? So, I mean, just saying that generally, sure, we could be oh, what's happening on Twitter? But maybe we're looking at a specific account on Twitter and what are they saying? So that's really going to help us figure out how salient this issue is or isn't. And then secondly, under politics, what are the political consequences for this person if they support us or if they oppose us? That really helps us figure out the stakes for them. And then we can help frame our argument in this way so that we're anticipating anything that they might bring up. Right? So anytime that we're asking someone to take a strong stance or public stance, they'll be like, oh, I'm not sure. People might XYZ, but we can anticipate that and say, we know you're worried about XYZ, and here's why it's okay. So lastly, plan, last P. So how do our answers to the questions above affect our plan and what we're actually going to do in this meeting? What are some logistical aspects that we can control to help us achieve our goal? And lastly, what's our ask? Let's be really explicit about that and get it on paper. So yeah, that's the 4 Ps. And I'll turn it back to Lizzie to take us into Q&A and close us out.
Excellent. That's sort of the quick version of research meetings and power mapping. So what could come next after you build your power map, you have some research meetings, you start to understand what's really happening in the area that you want to work on? Then you're ready. Maybe you're already starting to run actions, but then you're really ready to run actions to start to get the reactions from some of your targets. Maybe you're running an action to bring in a secondary target, but you can really start to sort of do the activities of your campaign and carry out your plan now that you have a clear sense of the field that you're working with. So Rising Organizers Action, some of our dear friends are running an actions and targets training tomorrow, Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern. You can also review the recordings from this training, and some related trainings would be Petitions 101. So learning more about the opportunity to use that petition tool and figure out how can you get more people to sign your petitions. There's also a Petitions 102 training, how to get attention to your petition and thinking about those decision makers and media, which of course very related to impacting and influencing your target. Finally, you can join the Move On volunteer team. So go to moveon.org/mobilizers. Those are the sort of next steps that we have for you today. We hope this was helpful, and we do have a few minutes for questions. So feel free to drop those in the chat and we can take some to answer some questions. We'll give folks a few minutes to put questions in there. Great. Question from Alyssa. What are some of the most common mistakes people make in their first research meetings? I can take a crack at this, and Vivian, I'm sure you have thoughts on this as well. For one of the mistakes that I made in one of my early research meetings was letting the target control the meeting. This I think is really, really common. You want to control the meeting. It is your meeting. It is your agenda. You want to make sure that you have questions that you want to ask. You have stories that you want to tell. You have information that you want to get. We just went into this meeting and we're totally bulldozed by the president of this community organization that we were trying to target. And he just, there was an age difference, which creates sometimes a power difference. And yeah, there was a power imbalance in the room, and he totally just steamrolled our group. And we didn't get what we wanted out of him. And he really just talked through the whole meeting, and we let him control the meeting. So for me, that is like one of the things that I'm always thinking about is how can I make sure that this meeting is happening on my terms and that I'm getting what I want out of it.
Agreed. A big one is control of the meeting and prep as well. I think something I've always noticed is like anytime I didn't prep, I'm like, you know what, I really should have. Anytime you stop yourself and say like, should we have a meeting beforehand? Yes. The answer is always yes. Especially when you're bringing in like folks who are new to it, stakeholders, community folks, like you want them to feel ready and good about what they're sharing. Because it's so easy. Like, let's say someone's in the middle of their story and then the target is like, I have a question. They get thrown off. Sometimes people are like, crap, I can't remember the rest. So we don't want them to feel that way. We want them to feel confident, really streamlined. Yeah.
Another question we have, any good sources you can recommend for getting some of this intel? So I always start with Google, and then I find myself like opening a bunch of tabs that I then sort of read through. But beyond Google, I like to look at any like public statements that they've made. If it's an elected official, like their voting record, or what does the media say about them? What do op-eds who support them and oppose them say? Really get a sense of like how the things that are being said about them, the things that they are saying publicly. And I also feel like that helps you understand what they're concerned about. So like, was their company did they have like a bad fundraising year? Are they going to be like really concerned about that? Did they get really slammed for taking some kind of controversial position or some kind of vote? So try to think about the things that are going to be top of mind, because most likely that is like what is stressing them out and what's like what they're really thinking about and what could potentially be a lever for you to pull on.
Just the internet is at our fingertips. But also like just like anything, right? As you build relationships with folks, I think I saw someone in the chat say that they use research meetings for coalition partners as well. So like those are partners that you can talk to for information too. So really use that community network.
Great. Vivian, you want to speak to, there's a few more questions in here. Maybe you can speak to time frames. How long should power mapping be?
Yeah, great question. So it will be continuous. As you're setting up your campaign, and a lot of times, right, especially if these are issues that are impacting us or really close to our community, like it's not like we're just going to start it. It's probably a campaign we've been fighting for a long time, but not in the same like organized way that we're trying to get to it too, right? So like when we're talking about power mapping, a lot of that is probably in your heads already. You're like, I kind of know who to talk to, or I know that if I'm trying to, reach this certain person, I got to go through their secretary. So for the like, formal power mapping, like I think that's worth usually 1 or 2 exercises with your group, so I was like, I'm referencing base building in my head, but I was like, with your inner circle and your base, like you want to spend a good amount of time with that, like maybe a couple hours. That way, because like we're not just like putting stickies on a map, we're also identifying, what's their interest, like what's their past record like with us on this issue, things like that. So, ideally your power map has all those details. Maybe just like the plus sign is just sticky notes. So, and that hopefully is just like you do that at the beginning. It shouldn't take more than a few days. But we want to be continuously updating that. So that's why Post-it notes are a great example, because as someone moves along or changes around, we got to revisit that, fix it, and really see like what the situation is day to day. So power mapping could be basically as long as your campaign, as your targets keep moving around, we want to make sure we keep up to date with that. Otherwise, we might assume that like someone's with us, but they're not, or someone's against us, but we actually have a more malleable person. So there's a really good example in unions is like when you're starting out organizing a workplace, you basically assess everyone 1 to 4, 1 to 5. And that's like how supportive they are or not supportive. But a lot of times what people do is they visit everyone in the beginning. They're like, that person's a 1. They're really supportive. Done. And they don't come back to them until 4 months later. And they're like, it's time to launch our union. And that person's like, what are you talking about? You never like called me back. Like, I don't know. I don't think I support this anymore. They went from a 1 to a 4. So we never want to do that. And that's why power mapping, that should be continuous. That should be part of the work that we keep putting into our campaign. Yeah. Oh, and I just see a follow-up from Latanya, like time frames for follow-ups, additional information. Good question. So like, let's say we have a first research meeting, we get some information, we want to follow up. I think that can be, again, as long or as short as you need. Like maybe, we want to take a week or something, because I think something implicit, definitely what Lizzie and I are thinking about is like, you have your prep, you do your action or your research action, you debrief, because debriefing, super important, right? Alyssa loves to say 80% of organizing is following up. And Alyssa's trained me on all of this. So I'm like, I take that to heart, right? But like debriefing and reanalyzing, just like making sure that we all understand like what's on paper is super important. So, how quickly that you're doing follow-ups or finding more information, that really just depends on like the coalition or the team that you're working in. So we want to move at the speed of trust, but we also do, want to move quickly depending on the issue. Oh yeah. Do you want to add anything, Lizzie, especially around like what does follow look like or momentum?
I think it really depends on the person that you're meeting with. If you have a target who you have this research meeting with them, they agree to meet with you, but it becomes clear that they are really, really opposed to what you're trying to do, you may want to like orbit them for a little while, like talk to people who might have their ear, talk to people who on your power map are going to be like high power and also high favorability to your position. Get their ideas about how you should approach this, because just going in and having another meeting and like making an ask of them is probably not going to go well if they're already really opposed to what you're trying to accomplish. But if you have a meeting with someone and they seem like they could be favorable or they are persuaded, like it might actually be really good to continue a relationship with them and to like continue to follow up to, maybe you invite them to something or you run an action that's targeting them, and then they can get a new perspective on your group or what you care about, and that will sort of move them into your corner a little bit more. So I think that like what happens after the research meeting really depends on how favorable the person is to your position. I did have one other thing to add that something that you said, Vivian, made me think of this, which is that power mapping can also be really good at like revealing your allies. You may not always think that you have like strong, powerful allies in your corner until you do your power map. And then you realize that like so and so's aunt is on the board of this organization and she knows this member of Congress or whatever. Like you may already have kind of like connections to your targets that are going to be really beneficial. And even if even if so and so's aunt is like not the person to go and talk to your target and say, hey, you really need to take this position or sign this bill or vote this way, they're going to have really good information for you about like what your target cares about and help you build your understanding of their self-interest.
And I just looked up a question from Melody in the chat that I was like, I can't answer. I don't know if you have the skills either, but Melody was asking if anyone has advice on FOIA, which is a great tool for research. So FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act. It covers the public's ability to access, any governmental information. Of course, there's always like redacting that might happen, or, especially at the federal level, they love to say there's a national security issue here, right? So I think that's a great question, Melody, on like, how do you file it effectively? How do you actually get the forms the information you're looking for? But just putting that out there in case anyone else on here is a FOIA expert or who is, I want to make sure that, you connect with Melody.
Yeah, speak up in the chat if you are a FOIA expert. I certainly am not. I've not had great luck with filing FOIA requests personally, but I have found like a surprising amount of information online, especially if you're targeting sort of public institutions. There's a lot of, you can find like tax records of a nonprofit, and you can find, especially for the federal government, there's a lot of congressional records that you can find online, and you just need to do sort of some digging there. Okay, we have a FOIA insight in the chat. Important to note that FOIA is federal. Each state has its own set of laws for open records requests. Thank you. That is great.
To Charles's question, which I think folks are trying to figure out or like go back and forth with in the chat, I think maybe one answer to it, I'm also trying to assess, but like I think maybe are you asking like how do we, persuade someone in a meeting, or like kind of bring our humanity to the meeting so that they don't look at us as just a person I'm meeting with, right? I think that's where storytelling is super critical. That's like a huge element of organizing, because that's what takes an issue from like, facts and figures to the meaningful, like, campaign that like impacts our lives, or just like this thing that I want to get involved with, right? Like yes, some people might become interested in issue through like a statistic, but what takes them to the next level is the organizing. And that's public narratives. That's story of self, story of us. So I was like, I know that's not in this training, but definitely like that's something you all can look into. And we also have trainings on that. So follow our social media. But yeah, thinking about it that way, so that you're not just necessarily presenting like, here's a memo and I'm going to read it out loud, but we're actually like trying to humanize this and bring those storytelling into our meetings.
Yeah, I think that's great. And one thing I would add about this like idea of us versus them, and we're using the word target and we're talking about targets, but I think that some of the trickiest organizing is pushing people who are like who are maybe in your camp, but they're not like totally taking the position that we want, right? We threw out the names Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema earlier, which is like feels really relevant to this point. And I think that's tricky because like for these folks, they see themselves as being on your side, and so it might not always make sense to like come in really hot and to be really like adversarial towards them. And so I think there's kind of an art that comes with practice where you can hold people accountable and ask pointed questions and push them without necessarily being confrontational. And I do think that like public narrative and sharing your story plays a big role in that. But like going back to the 4Ps, really thinking about what is the reaction that we want this person to have? What do we want them to think about us? I think that a mistake is that sometimes people can be really adversarial to folks who might see themselves as like being with you and might see themselves as being an ally to your cause. Great. We're getting great action in the chat. Speak now for any other questions. Cool. Well, we'll stick around for a few more minutes, but thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed training with you today. Enjoy the rest of the summit, and hopefully this information was useful to you and you took something from this. The slides and the recording will be available if you want to reference Vivian's example power map or any of the framework that we introduced today. Thank you so much for having us, and have a great rest of your Saturday.
Thanks for joining us. Oh, I see a question about where to find recordings, if Move On staff can answer that for us. But yeah, just enjoy the rest of the summit, folks. Your email. Love it. Star it, you know.